Hello and welcome to Raw Politics, Newsroom's weekly podcast and video chat on the big political issues. I'm Newsroom political editor Laura Walters, and joining me in Wellington is senior political reporter Marc Daalder. Hi Marc.
Hello.
And joining us from Auckland is Newsroom co-editor Tim Murphy. Hey Tim.
Hi Laura. Hi Marc.
Today on Raw Politics, we unpack the Tana saga, take a look at the state of global politics and check in on the government's climate strategy. And to wrap up, we will offer you some recommendations. The Greens are having a week. Another one, actually. On Monday, Chloe Swarbrick stood in Parliament's Grand Hall and announced that Darleen Tana is out. Well, out of the Green Party at least. Tana has resigned from the party following a protracted investigation into what she knew about the allegations of migrant exploitation at her husband's business and whether she lied to the Greens about what she knew. But despite begging from Swarbrick and the broader party, Tana has not yet resigned as an MP, meaning the Greens may be forced to use the waka jumping legislation that they have been so forcefully opposed to. Now, Marc, this seems to kind of wrap up this chapter of the Darleen Tana saga. Is it over for the Greens now, do you think?
I think it's not over till we get to see that report that Chloe Swarbrick has promised will be released. They just need to go through the process of contacting all the people named in it, which presumably includes some of the migrant workers who are alleged to have been at the center of this sort of exploitation. And so you can understand that might take some time to clear. But the longer it takes, the more it kind of feels like a repetition of the situation we've already been in of waiting for this report to come out in the first place.
What has it been? It was about 3 months, wasn't it, this investigation?
Yeah, 115, 116 days. It was worked out that Darleen Tana had been on leave as an MP for longer than she'd actually been serving as an MP before that. And that, of course, also included the Christmas break. For an international politics reference, we'll be getting into that later. I think Darleen Tana has been on leave for longer than Liz Truss was Prime Minister in the UK. So, not that that's a high bar to strike, but it was a long period of time that we've been waiting here. And I don't think anyone at the start of this inquiry expected it would be taking this long for us to get these answers.
And it seems like there was a lot of frustration from Chloe Swarbrick and from the Green Party more broadly about the length of time that's taken, about their inability to, discuss it with Darleen Tana and get her kind of collaboration and constructive input throughout that inquiry and, at this point at the end as well. So it sounds like maybe that drew it out a little bit. And while we are still waiting on that report, or at least the executive summary, as political parties like to do with these types of things, they don't often like to show us the whole report. We have had a bit of a sneak peek, haven't we, Tim?
We have, and that's come in the form of leaks from who knows whom. Darleen Tana, I see, is saying or implying that that's been leaked against her, presumably by the Green Party, to pressure her to jump. I don't think she will. I think people who find themselves in these situations are often defensive and headstrong, possibly because they're MPs, the egos are big. For the Greens, they shouldn't use it. They've been opposed to it strongly. It undermines, the fact that this person is now a parliamentarian, not just a member of the Green Party. And, I don't think that there should be this suppression of views in this way. So she will probably, in my view, stay. Don't know if it'll be for the full 2 years, but stay on, and they'll just have to live with it. Some are implying, I think, Winston Peters, that she might join Te Party Māori or something, but that's a sort of a facile, 1 and 1 is 2 kind of equation, I think. The Greens here have responded pretty well, I think, ultimately. Took a long time. And Marc, to your point about the, natural justice and fairness before they release this executive summary, they've had, best part of a week now, 4 or 5 days, a week since they got it. It's not that hard to go around the parties concerned and say, can we release this thing?
I'm interested in your point on the waka jumping, Tim, because there's been a discussion about whether it makes a difference if that person was elected as an electorate MP or brought in on the party list. Of course, Darleen Tana is a list MP, so she comes in on that party vote. Do you think that makes a difference to whether she should kind of be booted from Parliament or whether she stays in?
It doesn't to me, because she was 13th, which was always a very gettable number for the Green Party in that cycle. So she had a legitimate, and the public voting for the Greens had a legitimate, expectation that she could become an MP with them. She was a person whose praises the Greens and others sang, and looked like she was part of all that they were offering. So I don't think because she's possibly misled the leadership, which is essentially what this comes to, possibly, and been involved or had too much knowledge of what her husband's business might have done with migrants. Again, until we see the report and get more on that, you can't know that. But those things, don't disqualify you from the public's vote putting you into the House of Representatives.
It doesn't put the Greens in a good position, though, does it? Like we were talking earlier about whether you can draw a line under this at this point. For as long as she's sitting there in the House, there's potential to bring this up again. She could be agitating. And then the Greens don't get the opportunity to, bring in someone else. They're reaching pretty far down their list at this point with all of the issues that they have had and the departures recently. But despite all the troubles that they're having, both with Darleen Tana, then of course we've had recently the court case with Golriz Garaman, and then we've had some other kind of personal tragedies and things that have gone on with the death of Efeso Collins, and of course now with Marama Davidson on leave with a breast cancer diagnosis while she undergoes medical treatment there. But despite all of these things, all of these kind of this tumultuous time for the Greens, it doesn't seem to be hurting them in the polls at all, which I think is quite fascinating. The public support seems to be still behind them, and I wonder whether you have any thoughts on why that is, Marc.
Yeah, I think the question that we have yet to see is this a result of intrinsic support for the Greens, or is it a result of a weak Labour? Truth probably somewhere in the middle, a bit of both, but the question is to which degree, which of those ones is dominating. You look at the ACT Party, I think, is a good example. Prior to Christopher Luxon becoming the leader of National, they were polling quite a bit higher than where they ended up at the election than where they are now, for example. That came down after Luxon became leader, but it didn't go down to the 0.1% or whatever it was that they had in the 2017 election. So they've found a new level that they can kind of sustainably poll at.
Greens have a new normal.
Yeah. So the question is to what degree is the Greens' current position incorporating an increase to their kind of baseline, particularly in the context of, two major parties that are quite weak and quite a lot of that support going to minor parties in a way that's a little bit newer for us, even since the adoption of MMP.
And also how much young people, those young voters that are more likely to be greener, are captured in the polls, and also whether that then flows through into votes and things later on. How likely are they to actually show up on the day? I guess what I'm saying is, while they might be steady in the polls, would that actually reflect an election outcome if the election were held tomorrow? I mean, do you have any thoughts on it, Tim, why they're doing consistently so well despite all these scandals?
Well, I do. I think the Greens vote basically is the only vote around at the moment if you're voting with your heart and mind in terms of the climate. And so while, they have these personnel issues, either, tragic, medical or behavioural, a lot of people, if they're looking around to say who they would support now, there's not much else out there if you take that seriously. So that 10, 12, 13% who may well be the rock bottom, of the vote for action on climate, not just for the Green Party, don't have a whole lot of other places to go. So I think they've got a built-in advantage there and loyalty. But then the question arises, if someone else decides, some other party decides to take climate issues seriously, is there scope then for Labour to build back by taking more of that? National, they've tried blue, greens, and they've talked this for many years, but, if they were to attempt to do something there, they might. But it's probably the Labour Party are the only ones at the moment of the current parties who could eat into that by taking a more aspirational and, I think, effective tone on climate policy. So my view is that the Greens aren't being affected by it because their core vote doesn't have anywhere else really to look and to tell pollsters where they'd go.
Politics everywhere. No matter where you are in the world at the moment, you cannot escape it. Over in the UK, the Tories, led by Rishi Sunak, have suffered their worst defeat in the Conservative Party's parliamentary history. In France, there was an initial surge to the far right before a swing back to the left, but the future looks shaky and uncertain following the snap election that was actually supposed to clarify the political situation. Meanwhile, the United States continues on its path to self-destruction. Now, this podcast is not 5 hours long, so we aren't going to be able to unpack all of this, but let's take a look at the UK, now headed by Labour's Keir Starmer. Tim, what do you think we can learn from the Tories trouncing that we've just seen over there?
First thing is my old theory that people vote you out when they're sick of the sight of you. They're sick of the sound of you, they're sick of your entitlement and your donor corruption and your sort of scandalous temptations of incumbency that you get after many years just to a point that people just want to see the back of you. So, first thing. Second thing is that in terms of the system, that FPP compared to MMP, that tactical voting was incredibly effective for them. You know, we've got all the arguments about turnout being low, but a lot of that was to do with the fact they didn't waste votes elsewhere and they didn't need people to come out in their safe seats. So tactical voting, it has a sort of a reflection in a different way in MMP with those pivotal seats where parties don't advocate for their people so that the other party gets in. We know that, Epsom and so on. But there it was very effective. I think the age of fast swings between governing party results, you know, last time Boris won it by 80, this time the Labour's turned it around by 170. Ardern, you know, won the only majority in MMP in 2020, and a party, their party, the only party really that mattered in that governing arrangement, was able to burn and blow its political capital within 3 years. Boris's lot and all those other prime ministers blew it in 4.5. But this is the age where you win big, you don't necessarily have the guarantee of the second time up or third time up with lowering increments of the vote. You know, you're not burning away. So I think one thing that tells me is that governments, if they do get a decent majority in political capital, need to act quickly. They need to, and Jacinda's government didn't, as we know now, as we assess that 3-year period, run over, of course, by the COVID recovery and measures. But they weren't able to assemble the policies they really wanted to get a hold of with that majority and run them. Labour's come in the UK, it's behaving a little bit like, I hate to say it, or people might recognise it, like the Luxon coalition in just smashing through. You know, it cancelled the Rwanda immigration policy, it's changed the objections that were going to stop, you know, onshore wind farms and so on, this stroke of a pen. So when you get that power, you probably need to have a confidence, and Luxon will say this is what he's been doing, where you go and act, give people what they thought they want, and don't get held back by how unpopular it might be in the short term.
To your point of opposition's not necessarily winning elections, but, you know, governments or governing parties kind of losing them. I've seen a lot of commentary as well around how people just so desperately wanted a change, not just a change in party, but a real change in the way that, you know, politics is done, and that they will be looking for kind of a big shift in UK politics from Labour. Whether that actually happens or not is another thing, especially those younger voters that aren't necessarily happy with Starmer or not necessarily loving Labour, but just want something to change there. So it'll be interesting to see if there's fundamental shifts, and I think that there's kind of a similar feeling here in New Zealand as well from young voters. I'm interested in you know, your thoughts as well, Marc. 14 years is a long time. At the end, you just kind of naturally, you know, is at the end of their natural cycle. They were always going to kind of age out.
Yeah, I think it can be cyclical. You know, politics is cyclical, like Tim was saying. You know, you get to that point where it's just time for a change. And I wonder, you know, is this a scenario where Luxon is meant to take lessons from the Tories, because they're both right-wing parties, Maybe, but it almost looks more like Luxon's victory with that kind of change election, though the specifics of the change were maybe less important than the fact that there would be change. Looks a lot more like Labour's victory in the UK. And so I think that's where the best comparison is maybe there was something for Labour in the UK to learn from Luxon last year rather than Luxon to learn from what happened to the Tories.
Now, moving to another part of foreign politics, Christopher Luxon is in the United States this week for the NATO summit and delivering on his promise to, quote, raise the energy in key international relationships. Just quickly, this is the PM's fifth big overseas trip. He went to Australia, Southeast Asia, the Pacific, Japan, and now he's in the US. And this is probably his biggest test so far. So how do we think he's doing in his foreign affairs space? He seems to be, doing a lot there, but is he getting the cut through? What do you think of his performance, Tim?
Well, I'm relying here on very fine gallery correspondents who are travelling with him, including Joe Moore, our ex-co-host here. So, but I was struck by the fact that one of the Democrat senators that he met was Amy Klobuchar, who, to me, if that's the level of access you're getting in either side, is not very high. And we know he couldn't come through with, or at least they couldn't come through from the White House with a meeting for him, which had been long desired, as New Zealand Prime Ministers always seek them. So the level of access seems to be pretty middling. I might be shown up by his dinner tonight at the White House, in which he is expected to have met Biden at least on the sides, and some other leaders, of course. But in that respect, it seems to be pitched at a level that's not particularly high. But good to know he's like a sort of a happy Labrador up there on Capitol Hill, and jumping up and barking and wagging, and that's good. That's good for New Zealand.
And is some of it maybe as well not just the optics of who you're meeting? Is it at that top level? Are you getting to shake hands and put the photos out there? But is it building those connections among, maybe the kind of the NATO group, but also people who are important in the Pacific, the Indo-Pacific strategy, getting a little bit closer to those global alliances? I mean, how much is it that kind of behind-the-scenes work as well that's important in these things, do you think, Marc?
I think that's very important, difficult with Biden in particular, because even if he does get that meeting with Biden, not clear that the president would remember it the next day, let alone when it comes to the point where you have to make those leverage those international relationships. But yeah, I think trade deals, all that sort of thing, that's worked out at the officials level, but it is these high-level meetings that can help give those officials a steer or help put New Zealand on the map as a higher priority than it may have been prior to those levels and those sorts of meetings.
And since you raise it, Marc, I mean, Luxon there is there at a truly strange time for US politics. On one hand, we've kind of got a convicted fraudster, and then on the other side, an elderly man who can barely string a sentence together, vying to be the head of the most powerful country on earth. I mean, the US is having a normal one, right, Marc? I mean, are you feeling pretty proud of your country at the moment?
Yeah, it's all great. There's nothing to see here. Look, we're recording this on Thursday. It seems quite plausible that George Clooney might be the president come November, but things are moving so rapidly that it might be a Taylor Swift or maybe a Hemsworth brother. I guess they're Australian, so they can't quite.
And yes. That's the moment to hit the fake news button, I think.
Yeah. But when Luxon visited the United Kingdom in 2022, I believe it was, as opposition leader, right around when he landed, Boris Johnson stepped down as leader of the Conservative Party, of course, and Prime Minister. So there's I think quite a few Democrats, maybe Amy Klobuchar among them, who are hoping that he'll have a similar effect here with Joe Biden. Whatever quiet word or mystical effect or spell or curse that he put on Boris, can go to Biden as well.
And we're joking, but I mean it is a very real conversation here, and both Christopher Luxon and Winston Peters have been asked about Joe Biden's future, whether he should step down. They've both quite boringly actually said they are not going to wade into other countries' domestic politics. I mean, is that the right response, do you think, Tim?
Oh, heck yes. It's the wisest thing they can do. Say nothing, get completely out of it and keep completely out of it, I mean, if Luxon was to even contemplate commenting on the incumbent president's status, or saying something about the likely president's convictions or anything at all, it's just, for a little cork like us on a high sea, there's nowhere to go there.
Mm-hmm. And it's kind of led to the question as well, or leads into the question around Winston Peters. I mean, he was asked about Joe Biden's age, his ability to do the job. He's usually very defensive when he's asked anything about that. Should someone retire? What's your succession plan? Anything like that. He screams ageism. So I thought he dealt with this, this question with quite good humour this time around. But it does kind of lead into that question around Winston Peters as well. I mean, there's not a huge difference in their ages. Peters is 79, Biden's 81, just a couple of years older. Trump's just behind them on 78. Worth mentioning, George Clooney, only 63, and looking quite sprightly in his latest movie trailer. But yeah, it raises that question around Winston Peters as well, which comes up quite frequently. It came up, last time he was foreign minister that he was foreign minister. But do you think that's a valid question, especially when we're discussing it in terms of Biden at the moment? Does he still have the ability to do the job? Is there any question around his energy levels? He's got a very punishing travel schedule at the moment. Tim, we always go to you as our Winston Peters expert. What's your read on it?
I think he's a very, very different 79-year-old to Biden and some others around the world who are nearing that age. He's a pretty physically robust fellow. We don't often hear of Peters going off with medical ailments or weakness or sickness and things.
In fact, we actually saw him on a horse the last election campaign.
Right. Not quite.
We didn't see him get on the horse, but we saw him on the horse.
Not quite bare-chested like Putin, but he's a pretty robust guy. Now, I wouldn't say with him it's age. He'll be 80 next April. And that's, just the halfway point of this government. It's not so much his age. I would think his politics and the length and kind of out of timeness of some of his politics is more the issue with him. And you see it in Parliament in question time, where he's getting up almost as a stunt to ask supplementary questions of his own side, of his own Prime Minister and ministers. And they don't make much sense. And they're not really very funny. And they are
You can actually see them, sometimes those ministers struggling to decipher what he's getting at, right? They're trying desperately not to embarrass Winston Peters, to use it to help their own point that they're making. But you can almost see the cogs turning. What's he saying? What's he saying? How am I supposed to respond to this?
Their best answer is always just to say yes or no and sit down, because it could lead anywhere. And these things, that's my point, I guess, is it's not so much age, I think. It's kind of a tiring out politically and replaying political games and political memes and tropes that don't really work now in this era.
I thought, Tim, when you were saying that he's turning 80 next April and that'll be the halfway point that you're going to say of his political career. But
with Winston, who knows?
It's hard to say. But I think it's, there's an interesting question here around why different levels of, or different types of incoherence read so differently when we're thinking about, the fitness for the job. I mean, both Trump and Biden are incoherent in their own ways. You'd be hard-pressed to listen to a Trump campaign rally or press conference and say that he was, using perfect English and grammatically correct sentences to explain his points. But for some reason, I think the Biden stuff looks so much worse. And maybe that's a question of just the pace of it, which is, Winston's advantage as well. He doesn't pause and stutter. He's quick out the gate with some sort of retort. And by the time you realize that what he said didn't make sense, he's walked away anyways. And maybe that's the kind of incoherence that we go, that's okay. And behind closed doors, hopefully, he can take a little bit more time when he's interacting with foreign leaders and dignitaries and so on, to be able to put those sentences together in a way that do make sense. But at a certain point, there's a line somewhere, right? I think people are broadly in agreement that for Biden, he's past that line. For Winston, there's still a way to go, but eventually you get there. And the question, maybe for Winston as well, is how's he going to go? Is it like Biden, where everyone has to tell him to leave, or is it a scenario where he makes his own decision?
Going out on your own terms, I guess.
He's a long way away from our oldest MP, who was Nash at 86. So, he's got years to go, possibly. I wonder about, whether in those closed-door meetings he's as sharp as we hope he'll be too. And I don't mean that by, Biden style going to sort of drifting off on that, but just getting the kind of 2024's kind of vibe in diplomacy and politics. It's not something you can always get up to speed with if you've lived and been an active MP and foreign minister through decades and decades. Having said all that, there's a certain respect and regard and a sort of way that people in various countries and cultures, including the Pacific, can view older statesmen, the venerable, people with some honour and respect. And he no doubt gets that because of his time as well as his age. So, he's got those advantages. And having said all that, he still looks the part in the way that he turns himself out so smartly in his suits and, pocket squares and so on. He flashes a great smile, and he's blessed with that head of hair of sort of a Bob Hawke style sort of silver fox. So, that carries. And he's someone they can remember, and someone they probably look up to.
Winston Peters, the Silver Fox. That's a Tim Murphy quote.
The audience question for this week is, when will we see the government's emissions reduction blueprint? Marc, no doubt you've been watching this space.
I've been watching it because I was on leave last week, and I was fine, but I think the gallery office spent the week deathly afraid that the government's consultation on the second emissions reduction
plan, attest to that.
Yeah, would be released while I wasn't here. And while Dave Williams, our climate editor, was off as well, it would have sort of been a trial by fire. But no, it should be due in the next couple of weeks. It does seem like it's getting pushed out and out. It was originally due in June, and now, fingers crossed next week we'll see that plan. It's a big, ambitious document, or meant to be, about how the government will reduce emissions in the second half of this decade, and also our first kind of detailed look at what the government's climate policy is going to be, because so much of what we've seen so far is just what it's not going to be, which is all the stuff Labour was doing. So what does this government want to do? That's hopefully what we'll find out in the next week or two. So
we'll be able to unpack all of that on Raw Politics once it lands, but they have made a bit of a climate announcement this week, haven't they?
They very technically have, in that there was a press release and there was a document. It was 3 pages long. It was touted as the government's climate strategy, trying to give this high-level picture of what the government's approach to climate is, with 5 pillars, things like resilience and clean energy. I thought maybe, it was a ChatGPT derived document, given how vague it was. It could have been written by this government or the previous government or an AI. So I did ask ChatGPT to write me up a climate strategy for New Zealand. It actually gave me quite a bit more detail. It was quite a bit more interesting than the 3 pages we got from the government
So
this
you
week.
think that Watts could be outsourcing his high-level climate strategy?
Yeah, I mean, I did a
AI?
story the other week about Judith Collins wanting a government AI. Maybe they're testing it on the climate policy first. Simon Watts sitting there plugging in, I would like a climate strategy. Winston and David have to say yes to it, but it also needs to look good to the rest of the world. And ChatGPT is like, here's all we've got.
Marc, always be suspicious of strategies or policies that include the term pillars, for one thing. Second thing, was it any more impressive than the government's current quarterly plan of 35 or whatever it is, 40 action points?
Well, the 40 pillars is quite a lot more than 5, so maybe from there. But the action plans, we can criticize them on a lot of things, including that it's relatively easy to tick something off by saying we've taken a decision on this, or we have looked to do this, or investigated that. But there are specifics there, right? They're talking about specific policies in many of those things, others that are about raising the energy of our international engagement, sure. But they're talking about specifics. There was nothing specific in this document. It was very high level. We think that the New Zealand should be more resilient to climate, fueled extreme weather events. We think that technology will help us reduce emissions from agriculture. It's the sort of stuff that you'd expect maybe from a ministerial speech, but that there would be some more detail behind it. In this case, there wasn't.
Let's wrap things up with some recommendations, something you watched, read or listened to this week that you enjoyed. Marc, let's start with you.
I really liked Andrew Bevan's piece in Newsroom on a viral new marketing campaign for the City of Auckland, but it's disappointed one of Auckland's most important residents, the mayor. Worth a read.
Lovely. And Tim, what have you got for us this week?
I'm going to highlight Annika Smith's view on RNZ. I say view because they had seen the executive summary of that Greens report into Darleen Tana and were able to report extensively on it. It was valuable. It was obviously a leak, and Darlene's taken it a certain way, but great to have to answer some questions that were answered there.
I have another leak-based scoop this week. Mine is from the post on the leaked internal safety bulletin that shows the Aratiri ferry crew couldn't turn off autopilot, and I imagine Winston Peters is feeling at least partially vindicated after his tweet about autopilot and someone going out for a coffee. The scoop does show us that there were no hot beverages included, but that is well worth a read as well. That is it from Raw Politics for this week. Thank you to our producer, Dave Filoi-Ali'i, and our readers, listeners and viewers. Please send us any burning questions you have to laura.walters@newsroom.co.nz. You can find us next week here on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts.